So let's have this fascinating discussion now. The world's population, we're told, is projected to reach 8 billion by November this year. According to the latest UN World Population Prospects report, this is actually the slowest growth rate since back in 1950. The report also found that India will overtake China as the world's most populous nation by 2023. So to help us unpack some of the findings of this report, let's bring in the Director of the Population Division at the United Nations, that's John Wilmoth, who's live to us now from New York this morning. It's great to have you on the program, sir. Thank you so much for making time, especially when you consider it's an ungodly 20-1 in New York. So what this report has found is that, yes, population in the world is growing, but at a slower rate. The obvious question is that a good thing, or does it depend who you ask?
Well, it does depend in some ways. But the fact that it's slower, you're asking whether the slower growth is a good thing. I think overall it is. We've been living through an era of rapid population growth for the last 200 or 300 years. It's an unusual period in human history in which the population has grown rather rapidly. That growth reached a peak in the second half of the 20th century, around 1970, and has been slowing down ever since. And I think most people see that as overall a good thing, for the growth to slow down and for the human population to eventually stop growing.
Yeah. What are the... Oh, wow, that's an interesting final remark you made there. Is that even possible? Perhaps you can answer that question as you let us in on some of the factors that are leading to this deceleration, as it were, to population growth.
Right. Well, the growth decelerates because, the whole world is going through a process known as the demographic transition, which basically is a transition toward longer lives and smaller families. And this process started, 300 years ago in countries of northwestern Europe and North America, and it started globally in the middle of the last century. And so it's playing out in a similar way, but with different timing in different parts of the world. And so much of what we observe is the effect of the different timing of this transition in different parts of the world. But the natural course of that transition is for there to be a period of growth, and then for that growth to slow down. And as the growth slows down, the population age distribution shifts upward, and we get this phenomenon of population aging. So this transition produces two things. It produces first a period of growth, and then it produces a permanent situation of older population. And so we have to kind of adapt to both of these. We must adapt to the fact that there are many more people on the planet because of the growth, and also in the future, the human population will be much older on average, and we need to figure out what that means in terms of how we live.
Yeah, because, the impact, for instance, just from the top of my head, for the economy will be quite interesting when you consider going to the one extreme of population aging. Do we have any countries in the world that are dealing with that very unique problem, where there are just too many older people than there are young people? Because, for instance, it does complicate things like pension funds, where we know typically it's the young that pay for the old, but also employment. When people retire, you need younger people to fill in their posts.
Right. Well, I think most of the developed countries of the world, most of the high-income countries, are concerned with this issue because they're all going through it in a similar fashion. It's just that some are going through it in a more extreme way. And what determines how extreme or just moderate the situation is, what really matters is the fertility level. So for countries with very low fertility levels for the last 2 or 3 decades, some as many as 40 years, they've had very low fertility levels. I'm talking in particular about Japan, for example, is really the extreme case, but also in Europe, many countries of Central and Eastern Europe in particular have had rather low birth rates for quite a while. And this is producing a population that, it just means that each cohort that's born from year to year starts to be smaller than the previous ones. And the age distribution kind of becomes inverted. Instead of it looking like a pyramid, it looks like an inverted pyramid. And so I would say, that's in the extreme case.
Right.
In a more moderate case where the average fertility settles in around 2 children per woman, then you get not an inverted pyramid, but more like just a flat age distribution across the age range, tapering off at older ages, which is, I think, much more manageable in terms of the intergenerational relationships that you're referring to. The fact that the working age population has to support the older population, at least some segment of the older population. We forget that many people in the older population are very much qualified and able to work, and it's more a question of sort of pushing them out of the workforce than them not wanting to be there.
Right.
So we don't necessarily have to lose all of the productive capacity of the older population through this process. We can shift our thinking in terms of what is the normal age at which people retire, and encourage people to work beyond that point as life expectancies go up.
Fair enough. Yeah, that's exactly what I was about to say. What I also found was very interesting about the findings of this particular report is this idea around India potentially outpacing China to become the most populous nation in the world. I wonder what some of the contributing factors to this actually is, because on the one hand, China had that contentious one-child policy that was in place until as recently as 2015, actually. But on the other, one might ask questions around whether or not this has anything to do with the relative economic growth of both nations.
Well, it may be that China's very rapid fertility decline allowed it to focus on other things. Rather than raising large numbers of children, it was able to focus on educating them well and building its economy. And I think for all countries that go through this process, there's a point where there's an opportunity to really take advantage of the fact that the population of children starts to get smaller when fertility goes down, and the relative size of the working age population goes up. And in that situation, it's possible to kind of generate more rapid economic growth on a per capita basis, and to sort of jumpstart the development of a country. And in some sense, I think that's what China has done over the last 4 decades, and what India is kind of in the process of doing as well, but in a much slower and more gradual way. The birth rate reduction in China was rather rapid, and then it got to a point where the government came to the conclusion that it really had gone too far in some ways, and that they were concerned that population distribution was shifting too much to older ages, and they wanted to have more children coming into the population. And they've tried then to change the policy environment and to encourage people to have 2 or 3 children. We're not sure how well that's working yet. In fact, there's not a lot of evidence that it is working at this point. The Chinese fertility is quite low, and there's really an expectation that it will stay quite low for the next several years. So the population is beginning to decline. I think this year or next year is when our projections show it actually starting to decline. It's hard to say which of these 2 models is going to prove to be better in the end.
Yeah. I suppose
China's been very successful over the last few years, but it may be that in the long run that India's more gradual pattern of demographic transition, that may prove advantageous in the long run.
I suppose it's much easier to actually look at the data retrospectively and make decisions about what might have affected which kind of development. But thanks very much indeed for letting us in on some of the findings of this fascinating report as far as I'm concerned. Really do appreciate your time. John Wilmoth is the Director of the United Nations in the Population Division, as it were, speaking to us about this latest report, predicting where we're headed. By next year, we're told that India may soon become the most populous nation in the world, overtaking China. So that's quite interesting.